In the mid-19th century, religious life in the United States blended with the simple rhythm of small towns, farms, and neighborhoods that grew up around wooden churches and dirt roads. Sunday was widely accepted as a day of collective rest, not only as an expression of faith but as a social convention. Shops closed, courts suspended activities, and the neighborhood organized itself around a shared silence. This custom was not perceived as religious imposition by many, but as a natural part of public order, inherited from European traditions and reinforced by civil laws known as blue laws. For most Protestants, observing Sunday was as common as respecting work schedules or rules of coexistence. In this environment, religious freedom was understood in a practical and limited way. The state avoided favoring a specific denomination, but preserved Christian customs considered useful for social stability. Religious minorities existed, but were tolerated as long as they did not interfere with the collective norm. Faith was accepted as a private expression, while public life maintained broadly consensual religious references. For many citizens, this seemed a sufficient balance between individual conscience and the common good. It was in this context that dissenting Christian groups began to organize their religious life with greater clarity of identity. Among them were those who would later be known as members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Even before a formal organization, these believers lived scattered throughout rural communities and small towns, working as farmers, artisans, teachers, and merchants. The observance of the Sabbath, from sunset on Friday to sunset on Saturday, was part of their domestic routine long before it became a public marker of difference. In practice, this observance required quiet adjustment. Many worked longer hours on other days of the week to compensate for the Sabbath rest. Some negotiated with employers to avoid work during that period. Others accepted financial losses without protest, understanding that religious life demanded discreet choices. These agreements rarely attracted the attention of the authorities, as they remained within the private sphere. Religious freedom, in this initial phase, was not discussed in sophisticated legal terms. It was lived in daily life in the way families organized their time, how neighbors observed each other, and how communities reacted to visible differences. As long as Sabbath observance remained restricted to the home or small groups, conflict was minimal. The majority society viewed these practices as harmless eccentricities, as long as they did not challenge the public Sunday rest. Difficulties arose when faith extended beyond the domestic sphere. Merchants who closed their shops on Saturdays as well as Sundays drew attention. Farmers who worked on Sunday to compensate for Saturday aroused suspicion. In some localities, this resulted in informal warnings, public comments, or social pressure. Still, before the major debates, these situations were treated as local exceptions, not as national issues. The Adventists themselves, during this period, did not see themselves as public defenders of religious freedom in a broad sense. Their focus was on internal organization, the education of children, and the building of cohesive communities. Faith was understood as a personal responsibility before God, not as a platform for political confrontation. Records from the time show a greater concern with discipline, work, and family life than with civil law. Writings by observers of the movement, including Ellen G. White, describe this time as marked by simplicity and caution. References to government and laws appear peripherally, as part of the environment in which these people lived, not as an immediate threat. Freedom was felt to be sufficient as long as the state remained distant from daily religious life. In the broader context of the United States, the country was still grappling with deep post-Civil War tensions, economic reconstruction, and the redefinition of regional identities. Religion continued to play a central role in shaping society's morality, and the Protestant consensus offered a sense of stability. Few imagined that this consensus would be systematically challenged in the following decades. Thus, before public debates arose, religious freedom for Adventists was a practical reality, lived in silence, sustained by informal agreements and the expectation that diversity would remain discreet. This fragile balance, built in everyday life, prepared the ground for transformations that had not yet become visible on the historical horizon. As the century progressed, daily life in the United States began to become more connected and visible. Railroads shortened distances, local newspapers circulated more regularly, and decisions made in state capitals reached previously isolated villages. This process altered how religious differences were perceived. What had previously remained confined to the domestic sphere began to gain public expression, albeit gradually and often unintentionally. In small towns, commerce was a sensitive point in this change. Shops represented not only economic activity but also a sign of social conformity. Opening or closing doors on certain days communicated values. When some Sabbath observers kept their establishments closed on that day and chose to work on Sunday, the collective routine was subtly disrupted. For many neighbors, this did not seem like a neutral individual choice, but a breach of shared expectation. Local authorities generally did not seek conflict. Sheriffs, justices of the peace, and municipal councils were composed of men who knew the residents personally. The enforcement of Sunday laws depended more on community pressure than on systematic enforcement. In many places, these laws remained dormant, remembered only when someone stood out too much. Religious freedom continued to exist but conditioned on the ability to avoid drawing excessive attention. For Adventists, this period demanded constant adaptation. Many opted for professions that offered greater autonomy over their time, such as agriculture or handicrafts. Others accepted jobs with informal agreements, trusting more in the employer's word than in legal guarantees. These choices shaped the social profile of the group, creating communities that valued economic independence and a simple life. At the same time, the expansion of the religious press broadened the reach of ideas. Adventist publications circulated among dispersed readers, reinforcing identity and a sense of belonging. These publications rarely adopted a combative tone. They recounted experiences, practical difficulties, and reflections on coexistence. The central concern was how to live the faith coherently in a society that did not fully share the same convictions. At this stage, the relationship with the state was still indirect. Discussions about laws and constitutions appeared as a backdrop, not as a central theme. Most believers did not have legal training nor the expectation of influencing public policy. Religious freedom was understood as something guaranteed by custom and the distance between government and daily life, more than by legal texts. Historical records show that when conflicts arose, they were dealt with locally. Occasional fines, verbal warnings, or short periods of detention occurred, but did not generate widespread mobilization. Often, the accused himself accepted the penalty without appealing, understanding it as part of the cost of maintaining his religious practice. This behavior reinforced the idea that the problems were individual, not structural. Contemporary observers, including chroniclers like Ellen G. White, recorded this climate of transition with restrained language. Their accounts describe communities attempting to balance religious fidelity and peaceful coexistence. There are mentions of occasional injustices, but also of long periods of tranquility. The emphasis falls on the need for prudence, honest work, and respect for local authorities. On the national stage, the United States was experiencing debates about public morality, education, and cultural identity. Social reform movements advocated common standards of behavior, including Sunday observance as an element of social order. These ideas circulated in speeches, sermons, and editorials, creating an environment in which religious uniformity was seen as a civic virtue. For Adventists, this atmosphere did not yet translate into open confrontation, but into a growing awareness of vulnerability. Religious freedom, previously experienced almost invisibly, was beginning to depend on less predictable external factors. The goodwill of neighbors and authorities no longer seemed a permanent guarantee. Small, isolated incidents suggested that the balance could be broken if circumstances changed. This interim period, marked by quiet adjustments and scattered signs of tension, did not produce major headlines or organized mobilizations. Even so, it shaped the Adventist perception of the fragility of freedoms based solely on custom. Daily life continued, harvests were gathered, and newspapers were printed, but beneath this normality grew the feeling that the social environment was slowly transforming, paving the way for debates that would soon cease to be merely local. By the end of the 19th century, American routines were no longer defined solely by local customs. Industrial growth altered work schedules, concentrated populations in urban centers, and demanded new forms of social regulation. Factories operated in shifts, commerce became more competitive, and the weekly day of rest began to be discussed as a matter of public health and economic order. In this environment, Sunday gained new meaning, less linked solely to devotion and more associated with social stability. Sunday laws, previously applied irregularly, began to be seen as modern instruments for organizing collective time. State legislators defended common rest as protection for workers and families. The language used in public debates mixed moral, social, and economic arguments, rarely acknowledging religious diversity as a central element. For most, Sunday observance remained a shared cultural practice, not a controversial imposition. For Adventists, this change was first felt in daily life. Tolerance based on local custom began to give way to more formal interpretations of the law. Activities that previously went unnoticed began to be observed more closely. Working on Sunday, even for those who rested on Saturday, ceased to be seen merely as a personal choice. In some cities, it came to be classified as a public offense. Records show that many Adventists continued their routines with the same discretion as always. Farmers tended their land, printers operated their presses, and families maintained simple habits. The difference lay in the reaction of those around them. Anonymous denunciations, official warnings, and court summons became more frequent. These episodes did not arise from coordinated campaigns, but from a social climate that increasingly valued uniformity. The experience of religious freedom began to change in nature. Previously lived as a tacit agreement between individuals and the community, it came to depend on legal interpretations. Adventists who appeared in local courts rarely presented themselves as activists. They reported their religious practice directly, explaining Sabbath rest and Sunday work as a practical necessity. Many judges listened with curiosity, some with sympathy, others with impatience. These encounters with the judicial system revealed previously little noticed limitations. The law did not recognize exceptions based on individual conscience when the public interest was broadly defined. Fines and brief detentions became real experiences for ordinary people who until then had lived their faith without direct state interference. Religious freedom continued to exist in principle, but its practical application proved to be restricted. Within the Adventist community, these experiences began to be shared more systematically. Published accounts described short prison sentences, financial losses, and family difficulties. The tone remained restrained, avoiding open confrontation. The goal seemed to be to record facts, not to mobilize the masses. Even so, the mere circulation of these stories altered the collective perception of the environment in which they lived. Chroniclers of the period, including Ellen G. White, observed this scenario with increasing attention. Their writings record the tension between civil obedience and religious conscience as part of the historical context, not as a theological abstraction. The descriptions point to a time when political decisions were beginning to directly affect the private lives of minority groups. In the national context of the United States, the discussion about Sunday rest gained support from influential organizations. Religious associations and social reform movements advocated for clearer laws and uniform application. The idea that the nation possessed a common moral identity was repeated in public speeches. Little was said about those who did not fit this pattern, not out of deliberate hostility, but due to historical invisibility. For Adventists, this period represented a silent transition. They were not yet involved in major public debates, nor were they articulating broad legal strategies. Most remained focused on economic survival and maintaining community life. At the same time, it was becoming evident that freedom based solely on local goodwill was unstable in the face of increasingly centralized laws. Daily life continued with an appearance of normality. Children attended school, fields were cultivated, and newspapers circulated. Beneath this surface, however, experiences were accumulating that were modifying the relationship between faith and the state. Religious freedom was no longer merely a lived experience. It began to be considered, albeit in a fragmented way, as something that might need to be defended. This moment, in which daily practice clashed with more rigid legal structures, did not produce immediate ruptures. It created an accumulation of cases, memories, and records that slowly altered the group's stance towards society. The stage was being set for a phase in which silence would no longer be sufficient. and public discussion would become inevitable. At the turn of the 19th century and the beginning of the next, everyday life in the United States already reflected a country more self-aware as an organized nation. The state became a more visible presence through labor laws, urban regulations, and the standardization of customs. The average citizen felt this presence not in abstract discourses, but in defined schedules, applied fines, and rules that permeated daily life. Religion, previously confined to local practices, began to be affected by this same process of standardization. For Adventists, the accumulated experience of previous decades produced a gradual shift in perception. What was once seen as isolated episodes began to be understood as a recurring pattern. The arrest of a farmer for working on Sunday, the fine imposed on a merchant, the interruption of a household gathering ceased to be merely individual stories. They became indications of a legal environment that did not distinguish between a cultural majority and a minority of conscience. Nevertheless, the prevailing tone remained restrained. There was no rush to confront authorities nor a desire to provoke public scandal. Most continued to fulfill their civic obligations, pay taxes, and respect institutions. The difference lay in the growing attention given to written records. Cases were carefully documented, dates noted, and court decisions preserved. This habit of recording reflected a silent transition from lived experience to organized memory. The press played a central role in this process. Secular newspapers reported Sunday arrests as brief notes, often without context. Religious publications, on the other hand, offered more detailed accounts describing the impact of these actions on families and communities. The language remained descriptive, avoiding direct attacks. The goal seemed to be to make visible what had previously remained scattered, allowing readers to recognize common patterns. During this period, the idea of religious freedom began to take on more defined contours among Adventists. Not as an elaborate theoretical concept, but as a practical necessity. The implicit question ceased to be merely how to live one's faith in peace, and began to include how to do so when the law recognizes no exceptions. This change did not occur all at once. It formed slowly, from repeated experiences and the realization that custom no longer offered sufficient protection. Internal observers, including chroniclers attentive to their time, soberly recorded this transition. Ellen G. White described the period as a time when political decisions began to touch upon aspects previously considered private. Her writings do not contain legal texts, but reflect an awareness that the relationship between faith and state was becoming a relevant historical theme. In the national context, the United States continued to debate moral identity and social cohesion. Sunday observance was defended as a symbol of unity, especially in times of rapid economic and cultural change. Little space was given to the idea of a plurality of religious practices within the public sphere. This omission was not always the result of declared hostility, but of a homogeneous vision of society. For Adventists, this signified the gradual end of an era. The religious freedom lived implicitly, sustained by local agreements and social invisibility was waning. In its place emerged a reality in which the law needed to be understood, interpreted, and eventually questioned. This recognition did not immediately lead to organized action, but it profoundly altered how the group saw itself within the nation. Daily life continued as usual. Houses continued to be built, children educated, fields cultivated. The appearance of normality persisted. At the same time, historical awareness was accumulating that faith, when practiced differently from the majority, could clash with well-intentioned but inflexible civil structures. Thus, before the major debates took to the legislative and judicial stages, there was this discrete period of observation and learning. It was during this time that the documentary foundations, the collective memory, and the perception that religious freedom was not merely a cultural heritage, but an issue to be followed closely, were formed. This silent accumulation of experiences would mark the beginning of a new stage in Adventist history, when dialogue with the state would cease to be indirect and would begin to occupy the center of the historical scene. Looking at this period prior to formal debates, it becomes clear that religious freedom for Adventists was not initially defined by courts or public speeches, but by everyday life, by silent agreements, and by the expectation of coexistence within a majority social consensus. It existed as long as the difference remained discreet and as long as local custom was stronger than the letter of the law. When American society became more regulated and uniform, this freedom revealed its historical limits. Before becoming a public issue, it was a lived experience slowly recorded and understood only over time, making it clear that the transition from silence to debate was the result of an accumulation of interrupted normalities and not of a sudden confrontation.